or actually Chantel Gamble.
All right, thank you. Thought we switched it up. Let's switch out our spotlights. All right, thank you all for joining us this morning. So we are going to go over our land acknowledgement. So we respectfully acknowledge and honor that we are on the traditional lands of the Lenape and Canarsie, who have stewarded this land for generations, and we pay our respects to elders, past, present, and future. So today we ask that you drop in the chat the names of ancestors who you want to bring into this space, whose spirit, whose personality, whose legacy would you like to bring in this space to cover us this morning. We ask that you drop their names in the chat and I will read them to bring them here with us in spirit. Feel free to name family, friends, community members that you want to bring here with us today to move this conversation forward, to bring us to life, to bring community together. So Virginia C. Gray, Ruth Sims, Victoria McKay, James Sims, Barbara Dean, Almeda E. Treach, Val Baker, Tina Turner, yes, Sonia Johnson, my great-grandmother Rose Bourne Alexander, Octavia E. Butler, Gladys Sanders, keep them coming, Lee Ming Ju, my grandmother Catherine Johnson, Shirley Chisholm, Celeste Smith and Natik Jalil, Shirley Chisholm again, yes, Toni Morrison, and Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Josephine Slade, Sunny. All right. And we also want to know, what land are you on right now? So we're going to drop this in the chat as well. Thank you so much. All right, and this might be helpful. Let's see, hold on. So you can all type this in and join us in letting us know where you are. And I am in Jersey right now, so I am on the land of the Lenape. All right, so we just dropped it in the chat. Please feel free to take a look and see what land you are on and put it in the chat. Thank you. We have Lenape, Musi. Okay. And again, we want to honor those who came before us, ancestors, the indigenous lands that we are on. And I'm going to turn it back over to Trisha or Issa, actually, to get us started. And thank you all for bringing this energy, this spirits into our space, this ancestral call to bring them here with us this morning.
Thank you, Chantel. Good. Greetings, everyone. We are so delighted to have everyone present on this beautiful morning. The purpose and direction of this particular panel discussion is focusing entitled Remembering and Reclaiming Our Neighborhoods. It is a community discussion that will delve into the vital significance of preserving and rejuvenating our neighborhoods, which have rich historical and cultural value. Through the valuable perspectives of esteemed community leaders, passionate historians, and dedicated activists, we aim to explore effective strategies for cherishing and reclaiming our beloved neighborhoods. By empowering our residents and cultivating a strong sense of belonging, we aspire to create an environment that honors our cherished heritage, encourages the sharing of stories, and fosters an open dialogue that will wholeheartedly celebrate the enduring spirit and liveliness of our African diaspora communities. We are so happy to have our moderator, Bianca Mońa, who is an artist, art administrator, curator, educator, and advocate, and our panelists, Ina K. McPherson, who's the garden founder and co-leader of Tranquility Farm and Feeding Tree, a garden advocate, Bed-Stuy. Peter Dwayne Robinson, who is the assistant professor of architecture and design at Cornell University and founder of Work Urban and co-founder of Black Space. And last but not least, Quardean Lewis, the founder and executive director of Youth Design Center and Made in Brownsville. Thank you so much, and I'm passing the baton to you, Bianca.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Happy Saturday. The sun is shining. The sky is light and airy and blue. I am very grateful to be here with everyone virtually. I have my water. I hope you have your libations and your snacks, and I hope you really are able to get into our conversation this morning. I have a background in oral history centered sound work. I'm a sound artist, but I base my practice in conversations with my neighbors, to be quite honest. And I am an alumni of all of the Laundromat Projects programs. I've been participating since inception of the organization. And so I'm always grateful to be in conversation with this community. I want to turn it over to Miss Ina first, because one of the projects I've done in the past is oral history projects with gardeners. And so I met Miss Ina maybe, I don't know, eight years ago, 6 years, a while ago. And I've seen her transform community. So I want to pass it to her first so she can, just grace us with her knowledge of these gardens and these lands in Bed-Stuy and Central Brooklyn.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Bianca. My history with the Laundromat Project goes way back. Even before Tranquility Farm, I think maybe in the early 2000s, I was introduced to the organization by a community associate, and so it's ongoing. And so here we are today, many years later. I am so proud and energized to see how the organization has grown and how it has been able to pivot back to the community of Bedford-Stuyvesant, where our work is grounded here. I like what Bianca said. Her work is grounded by speaking to our neighbors, and it's basically our mandate also. Our work is all about community. We don't really want to go to Manhattan or even further. We want to be in the neighborhood. We don't even want to go to Clinton Hill. We want to stay, talk to the man on the street. And all our work is grounded in that. I started out with gardening, but this stage, it seems that I'm even venturing more into a historical venue of amplifying the work of my neighbors that have been obscured. I'm just getting involved with, it's the most amazing project. A gentleman that was involved in a noted organization that you all know about and heard about. And for more than 50 years, his work was obscured and ignored. and he was a pivotal, founder of this organization. And this was revealed to me, and I hit the ground running. And so there was an announcement made, and there'll be even more. And so, it's now that I'm unintentional historian, but really it goes to the heart of the work that we do in the gardens, is to support, best and horticultural pursuits, and to amplify the work of our neighbors, the man on the street, and just a common man, and really, we want to affirm all the good things that happen in our neighborhood by people that look like us. I will stop there.
Thank you for that. I want to head over to Quardean, because he comes from this vantage point of working with our youth. And I think I would like to learn more about his work and his involvement with future generations. How do you keep this work going? How do you keep the ideas fueled and inspired?
Yeah, so thank you for, I'm excited to be here. The work that we do in Brownsville and across Brooklyn now at Youth Design Center started because of a need that was requested not only from adults in the community, but specifically from young people. And we understand that, like, the young people, the power of creativity in young people is boundless, right? Like, the older we get, the more jaded about the way that systems work. But the energy that they bring to new ideas and new thinkings about the ways that they operate and navigate the world is really fueling for a lot of the work that we're able to do with them. So Youth Design Center's model of, as a creative agency that's led by young people, and training and employing them to be able to not only work around their own economic mobility, but work within their communities to create solutions to their own challenges. It's not necessarily anything new. Like, Brownsville as a community has been innovating out of necessity for decades, out of the need to kind of like solve our own problems because of the concentrating poverty in a specific area, as cities tend to do, and the inventions of like Planned Parenthood and methadone clinics and recreation centers, and more recently, still 50 years ago, the teacher strike, Ocean Hill Brownsville teacher strike of 1968, right? Like the pilots that come from that, being able to have control of district schools at a local level for a Black and Brown community, right? Like, those are things that are pushed from the ground up because of a groundswell, like of energy, of advocating for the change that needs to happen in order for a community to move forward. So we work at that level with young people to understand, like, they're the next harnessers of the community, and that they come from a lineage of this work, and to push it forward, they have to have the keys. And that's what our equity-centered design work in our communities is about.
Thank you for that. I want to ask Peter to join our conversation because he comes from a vantage point of space and place. So Peter, can you tell us a little more about what you do?
All right. Hello, I'm so excited to be here and join in on the conversation. If you give me a moment, I'd like to just share a few slides. It's a different format, and it's a unique week that we've had in New York. On Wednesday, I was to present at the DEIB conference for the Board of Ed, but that was canceled. And one of the things I was going to talk about was something I'm really glad to share with you now today as a way of introducing myself and really talk about the work that I do. And also to share, I think it's pretty sort of kismet and amazing. I've been familiar with Laundromat for a while now, and also I've worked with Quardean on several of the sort of youth engaged practice projects. Some of them were actually born out of the relationship when YDC was made in Brownsville, and a lot of the best practices came from that. And so one of the things I'd like to share is I'm a founder of an organization called Work Urban. And so Work Urban partners with communities and institutions and individuals and engage students on a pathway toward leadership and empowerment. And we've worked in the past with Medgarber's College Prep, Transit Tech, and generally across the city with My Brother's Keepers Alliance. I'm going to share with you my great colleague and mentor, Sharon Sutton, has recently published a book that literally just came out this week. And she has been one of the forebearers of community engaged practice in architecture, spanning a 40-year career. And in her new book, Pedagogy of Beloved Commons, in the conclusion, and this is where I believe I share so much in terms of her stewardship, I set out to explore an aspirational framework that would help young people take hands-on action within the commons of low-income neighborhoods where they witness daily symbolic reminders of their abandonment and marginal status. I began by proposing that the emotional, physical, and intellectual realms of place-based critical pedagogy could help them ameliorate disinvestment in community infrastructure and amplify their political voice. And so I'm going to share with you a project that we were able to do in collaboration with Transit Tech High School in East New York and my studio and University, our community partner, last semester. Rights Lights Insight was a project conceived of by two of the graduate students in our design studio. We had spent the semester working with University, really thinking about how their programs and spaces could sort of be amplified and how we could begin to think about how youth engagement could become a part of the mission work that they do. Part of what and I'm sharing with you a series of quotes from the New York City Public School. There are 4 pillars of working with the New York City Public Schools. So scaling, sustaining, and restoring what works. The first impetus was to make sure that we were invited into the school by the principal, Marlon Bynum, who is a Brownsville native and actually was one of the youth that was raised at the Brownsville Heritage House, one of the earlier projects that we had been involved with. And so it meant working with the teacher to ensure that the ideas that were coming out of the studio that our students wanted to pursue in collaboration with our students would fit ideally within the matrix of what this particular science teacher, Ms. Lorna Hurston, was sharing with her students. It made sure that the proposal, which began to talk about vacant lots in East New York, Brooklyn, look at precedents that dealt with available open spaces in cities across the US, and with particular care to think about New York City and East New York. We were lucky in that we had a community partner who, one of them, their family had several vacant lots in the community or lots that were empty. What it did for the high school students in East New York, Brooklyn, was enable them not to see their community exclusively as a problem, not to see sites in their community as that which was inaccessible to them, but really begin to think about their community and the spaces that were available, that they could have action and build relationships with property owners and build ways to think creatively about how they could address issues in their communities. And so prioritizing wellness and linked to student success was a huge part of how we began to frame the community. So we had access to this unutilized vacant lot that was owned by the family of one of our community partners. And part of what we were thinking about were ways to mitigate stormwater runoff, ways to mitigate pollution in the neighborhood. And so working with the high school teacher, there was this idea to create bioswales. So bioswales are ways to sort of mitigate stormwater runoff in the neighborhood, and really thinking about not the challenge of creating a bioswale exclusively, but how to create a kind of a creative practice around that. And so part of the thinking was, what if we thought about these as light events, ways to also have a conversation about the quality of lighting in the neighborhood. Our students had done research to demonstrate that the light levels in East New York were higher than in other parts of the city. And why was that? It was issues of security, issues of safety. And so we began to think about ways that these bioswales could be glow in the dark or be illuminated at night. And so it helped the high school students think about ways that they could have real creative impact in their built environment, and that there was something didactic they could point to and say, I was a part of transforming the space, if only temporarily, but then really understanding that the sites that they walk through have histories and there are ways to negotiate access. You don't simply see your neighborhood as places I can't operate in or that I can't have impact in. And so we had worked with the students over a series of weeks that led to installing the bioswales at the site. We worked with the family that owned the site to make sure that we were good stewards of their property as we ran this experiment. And one of the amazing things that happened is because it didn't work, the glow in the dark experiment didn't work on site, we were lucky that we had a community partner where we were able to go into their warehouse to run the experiment so that the students were able to see that how the glow in the dark event would work. And so ultimately, I shared this project because it achieved a series of things. It demonstrated that we could work effectively with a community partner who was already a steward of the community. We could bring in high school or New York City public school partners to make sure that we worked seamlessly with what was happening in their learning experience. I had met with Lester Young 2 years ago. It was actually the year that I think the year after we worked with Quardean's youth. And one of the things that he had asked, Lester Young is the chancellor of the Board of Regents. He said, whatever you do, don't create a ninth period. Find ways not to give our youth more work to do. And by doing that, by working directly with the teachers, directly with the principal, we were able to create a way alongside our community partners to have an effective sort of relationship where young people began to think about their communities, began to think about the spaces in their communities, and began to think about ways that they could actively engage and make a positive impact in their community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for that. You said a couple of things, a couple of words sparked some ideas for me. And so, you know, what I was thinking about as you were talking was, how do we get not just youth, but community involved in like tactile, hands-on, tangible experiences? I was thinking about the ideas of not just, I think you used revitalization, but also reimagination. And then what we know that has historically happened in our communities is there's vacant land. And so how do we use all those ideas to work with, to feed our community, to involve our community? And with those same ideas that you talked about, Peter, I actually want to go back to Miss Ina. And if she could talk to us a little bit more around Tranquility Farm. That was the site we were supposed to meet at this morning. If you can just talk to us about how it came to be, what you guys seek out to do, how does it serve to preserve history and community, and how do you get folks involved?
Okay, so the access to land, which is really a sore point in New York City, there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of vacant land. New York City, HPD is the largest landowner in all of New York City. And their mandate is development. It's not community development. It's a capitalistic view of going up high and creating these apartments that can only be occupied or attained by people of a certain economic level. So here we come, community gardeners, we're stakeholders. Most of the land that we have access to are land that is in our neighborhoods, that we know how it became vacant because we've been there long enough. We know the people that own those land, the land. And so a lot of it is based on guerrilla tactics, because no one is going to give you land. You have to develop your own way of getting this land. And there's huge kickback because they are organized. They're much more organized than we are, but we have people power. And so, and that prevails. And you tie that in with hard work and organizing. You have to, you know, the single purpose of talking to your neighbors, getting together, and never discount what you can do as just a regular, ordinary person without any kind of a so-called assets. You can. We acquired specifically Tranquility Farm. Well, all of community gardens are based on capturing land, really. It's all guerrilla tactics. And then once you make it valuable, the city steps up. They never see it before, but once you get there and you add value, then you have their attention. And that's when they come in on you, and then we kick back and we fight. And most times, I'd say we prevail because of the support of the community and the focus of getting the land. So we got Tranquility because Tranquility is built on vacant land for 30 years. That was just a fallow land. Previous to that, there was a yeshiva located there and a Jewish synagogue across the street. And so it was owned by European Jews. And but then after we moved in, they moved away. And so we got a little access. And so our gardens, we discovered it because we lived in the neighborhood. I lived around the corner, passed it every day. And I put a proposal into Green Thumb, who is the city agency tasked with supporting our work. And they listened to us because we had prior history with other 2 gardens. But it was a provisional permission that they gave us. Provisional, renewable on a yearly basis. But we didn't hear that because we knew that once we got access, we're not going to be moved no matter what. So even though we had the only currency of the work that we had put in the community. And so sure enough, 4 years later, they wanted the land back. And even though we were functioning and the garden was there, we were covered by the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and it's verdant space, they only saw it as a vacant land. Imagine that. How do you look at a place that's planted up? We had programs going there. All our infrastructure is built by high school kids from the neighborhood, from the housing projects. And they know the work we do, but they saw it as vacant land. And so we fought them for 1 year. They put up the lot for $1 to developers. And they were swooping down on us. They used to pass, drive around, casing the joint. And I give them the finger because I knew what they wanted. And they would go to the stores and they would inquire and speak. But all our community partners, the people around us, supported us because we made it a point of having the community buy in, that they know we're there, but we're there on their behalf, but they have equal ownership and access as we do. So we suffer, they suffer. And they said, oh no, it's the garden. And they said, oh, we're gonna be putting up a 8-story building. They said, oh, no, no, no. And they gaslight these people. And then they see me and they say, but Messina, you said the land is protected. I said, yes, it is. You see that leaf? But these guys said, anyway, we fought them for an entire year in 2014. We organized with our schools. We're attached to the school at St. John's. The kids came out early morning in the dead of winter, dressed up like vegetables at City Hall. And we wrote letters, neighbors wrote letters. Oh my goodness. The mayor's office wanted to know who are these people, what are they doing? The letters were so heartfelt in broken English, but the point got across. And so they recognized that we are really connected to the community. And so in 2015, 1 year, we fought them 1 year. Every day I was posting on social media, one line, we seek to be conveyed to New York City Parks Department. That's it. We had no other dialogue. The narrative was, we seek to be conveyed to New York City property. And Mitchell Silva, who's our commissioner, Brother Pratt alumni, he came out to see our garden, and which was unusual because we're not part of their portfolio. We were illegal. We had no license, and he came out to see us. And I knew when he came to see us, and I posed him next to our makeshift sign. We had a sign made by a community member. It was women oriented. It was on board and painted in pink ink that says the garden name, just a piece of, raggedy wood. And I posed him, I posed him next to the sign, and he whispered to me, said, wait till they see this. And we were conveyed months later in 2015 to New York City Parks Department. And that's how we were saved. And we're still, the end, because you could put up 3 buildings on our lot. We have 2 addresses, 2 gates, and we're the main. And our gardens take up a majority of city land. We're on a bus route, thoroughfare, and 2 of our gardens bookend. So there are only 3 houses on a New York City lot. So, just think, if we think about it sometimes, it would be scary to say that how long can we survive? And we know that eminent domain trumps everything, but we think the will of the people will prevail. We are now a part of New York City Parks portfolio. and it's getting, cases like these are getting scarcer and scarcer because it's harder to get land now. It's very hard to get, but the possibility do exist that you can, but you cannot do it by yourself. You have to have a coalition of your neighbors, and you have to really, really work hard by, actually doing stuff that they can see, make your property looks nice, connect with the schools, the daycare, the man in the street, because they are our biggest advocate, is the people that we don't even have direct contact with, but they stay in their apartments and they see and they watch and they, send messages. They keep running into our fences. And I remember one year they ran into the fence, and before I got there, they had everything. So when I got on spot, they had everything, and we were able. The person that did it confessed. She came over and she confessed. She said, because she had. So you cannot do anything without the will of the people. Community is everything, and it is dynamic, and it is productive, it's affirming, it is everything. And the possibility still exists to get access to land, but you have to be determined. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I want to ask Claudine if he could talk a little bit more and expand around the idea of the will of the people and people power. Specifically, what tactics or what have you implemented with the residents in your area and the folks that you work with in order to make them a stronger, united voice?
Just snaps to Enough and that work, because I wanted to just like cheer you on in that, just like thinking about how particularly like even sometimes you don't have the ownership of the places that you want to transform, and but we know that like for neighborhoods like Fort Greene, the reason that there are still Black people there is because there was a high rate of Black ownership historically in the neighborhood that curbs complete displacement of people of color, and so I think foundationally, like we try to kind of communicate to our young people that ownership is key to keeping gentrification at bay in particular, but we then have to understand and acknowledge the histories of the neighborhoods and why we don't have the keys to all the spaces to begin with, right? And there are many reasons for that, including the disinvestment in the city and policies from the federal government for giving mortgages and such in the early 1900s. And so we make it very clear that like these are the circumstances and none of them are your fault. But then we kind of like show examples around kind of like how you can take back space and guerrilla style, or if you go through bureaucracy, there are many ways to go about to do it. But really what stuck with me was like thinking about whose streets, our streets, right? Like that as a mantra of advocacy and protest. And I think of, if there's a space in your community and nobody's, you don't know who owns it and nobody's claiming it, or even if it's like for us, we for instance, at a plaza on what used to be a dead end street in Brownsville, between kind of like the commercial corridor and where the public housing, high concentration of the public housing in Brownsville starts. And the young people envisioned it as a permanent plaza that could be used to bring vitality to the commercial corridor, increase foot traffic, but also kind of like a place that they can bring dates that isn't like going all the way downtown Brooklyn, and having these intentions for space within their community. But then the street belongs to the city, right? Like the Department of Transportation has to come in and say, okay, you can have this. We have to actually go and get permission from an entity who isn't necessarily there, right? Like but there are other groups, for instance, that do anti-violence work that can like go and occupy a space for a night, and they're going to say like, our catchment area is these 4 corners, right? We're going to stand here tonight and make sure that nothing occurs, right? There's no gunfire, there's no fights that erupt, because we as people, with autonomy and authority over our own streets and our own safety and agency, can kind of claims a space in our communities and enforce our will on it at any given time, right? And I think it's about the people's access to that agency, right? The collective efficacy of people to know that they can go and do that, and then kind of like wait for the authority that tells them that they can't, right? But we need the right people to have the desire to do that, right? And I think that a part of our work is letting young people understand that they have the power to do that in their communities, by making plans and having the creative education to produce the renderings in one of our 3D design courses, that can show what that space might look like if it has been transformed into a public asset or a teen center, for instance, like one of our projects. The Chester Street Garden became through the use of shipping containers and transforming a developer space into a garden, right? Like the power to kind of like create an imagery that kind of alludes to the future that is inclusive of the people who currently live or will live in a place, is a very powerful, it happens the other way all the time when architect companies are making renderings of buildings in our communities. Sometimes they leave out the Black people, right? The renderings have a different population than what currently exists there, and we have the power to do the same, right? To manifest through leveraging the tools and technologies that are afforded to the people who make decisions for our neighborhood to make those decisions back up or sideways. Yeah, we also kind of like, I think what's another important part of the discussion is kind of leveraging media and the changing times and how stories are captured around these types of advocacy. So like when I was doing my thesis research at Harvard for NYCHA housing and how it could be different, like in Brownsville, the history stopped when the books stopped. It felt like, right? And the people who wrote the books were largely a Jewish population that was in Brownsville from like the early 1900s to the 1970s or so. And then there was like no history. It's like, what happened? And so I had to kind of like, go about other means of kind of like understanding that there's oral history, right? And that the medium for capturing history has changed, right? So I had to use YouTube more because there are, local people that were walking around with cameras and doing interviews with people at like the Old Timers Day and capturing those like really pre-cultural moments that happened in Brownsville from the Black and brown people that live there that weren't being documented in the traditional ways because of new media. And as many of us know in some of our communities where the media attention that we get is sometimes out of our control because the news loves trauma, and to proliferate that, right? The narrative of our neighborhoods gets taken away from us, and if we don't have the tools to capture that narrative ourselves and tell our own stories. So that's in our digital media class. That's what we give them cameras so that we're closing the access gap for leveraging the technology that they need for low-income students. But to tell their own stories, to create documentaries, to create one of the documentaries that they made as a capstone of their studio, their videography studio a couple of years ago, was for the Brownsville Plan, which was a city initiative, HPD, to kind of like go around, and really it was for the purposes of garnering support around the building of hundreds of thousands of units of affordable housing across the city, and what other kind of like programs and assets that they want to put around that. And trying to get us in groups engaged in doing that work, but not necessarily doing the work of organizing that they necessarily needed to do at a scale. When I was asking for like, oh, can we just you want us to promote this thing? Can we get $50 out of your budget to like put it on our social media that reaches thousands of people in the demographic that you want to reach? They're like, oh, let us think about it. And then no, right? So are you actually trying to do the work to if you have, a couple people on your staff that are getting paid $50,000 to $70,000 a year to do this outreach work, if you're not actually willing to pay $50, are you really trying to reach the people to get them at the table, to get them involved in your conversation? And so it leads to then, a year later, people not knowing what that initiative was, the Brownsville Plan, and our students then made a documentary that went around asking people, did you hear about this? Did you know these things are coming to your community? What are your thoughts about this? To be able to kind of like document that and their perspective, their understanding that it wasn't as effective as the city would like to say it was, right? And I think that that's an important piece of the work in changing policy and advocating for how government should engage in our communities. And the young people that was their brainchild, because once they heard about it, they're like, other people need to know about this. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for those really solid, clear, thought out, inventive, but also intentional examples that you shared. With some of the things you said, there's a phrase you use called narrative of neighborhoods. And I want to turn to Peter a little bit with that idea around, if you could share with us, what are some like innovative best practices? What have you seen? What have you witnessed? What do you advocate for in terms of how, as communities are reimagined, how do we create the narrative of the community? How do we respect the cultural heritage of the community? Like, what are the things that you suggest or have seen?
So one of the chief things I advocate for is network and leveraging. When we work with young people, one of the first things I try to impress on them is help them to recognize that they have the power within their community, that they have the network within their community, they have access to people who are making change in their community. And so I lead with that. I have a colleague, Heidi Nast, who talks about relational ontology. She talks about before supremacy, there was ontology. There was a way that African people would sort of gather and work together collectively and share resources. So from working through youth, through schools, through community, it's always helping young people to see and understand where their networks are and how to build from their positions of power, to never see themselves as not having power within the context of their communities. Also, it's been wonderful over the last 5 years to have a really productive partner in the DOE. One of the great things about how and part of it's structured through, supremacy, that the reason why the DOE is so segregated is the history of supremacy in New York City. But what that affords is when you have students who are now traveling across 5 boroughs to go to schools, you'll end up sometimes with students from the Bronx going to schools in Brooklyn. And so when you talk about Black community, they don't see it as not being their community. There's an innate understanding about what community is, in spite of the attempts to sort of destroy and fracture Black communities. That's one of the things that it's always amazing to me, because I'll always get the challenge, oh, but these kids don't live in this community. I was like, it's not a problem for them. And they have the support of their schools who are in that community. And the schools, sometimes good schools will have support of really strong principals and strong superintendents. And those superintendents will have done the work to build capacity with sort of entities in their communities. And so that's always an amazing sort of infrastructure to know that I'm walking into. And so to answer your question, that's sort of a long way of answering your question, but I think that's really important as a premise. And so all the work has always been, I'll demonstrate to you who I know and how I know this person. And and then you take that and build off that. So we began the work with My Brother's Keepers Alliance because I knew George Patterson, who is married to my cousin, Malika Patterson. And he had been put in the position of leading MBK. And I said, hey, can we work together? I've got some students at Cornell. Can we work with MBK students? And George Patterson said, because at one point I had gotten Quardean to give a lecture at his high school to talk about the work of YDC. He said, oh, but you know this guy Quardean. I think Quardean went to the school, Medgar. You know, that principal is Jamaican. You're Jamaican. You should work with Medgar. All right. That built a relationship where we said, okay, so can we bring 14 Black boys into the Cornell Design Studio? And this is happening all over COVID. This is happening online. This is happening with us standing in front of cars with masks on, having conversations about how we can bring 14 young Black boys into the design studio at Cornell, and how is it going to work? And it worked. It worked like gangbusters. It worked like gangbusters because we had people who were committed to making that particular network work. The studio was based around asking 14 young Black youth, what does it mean to be in your community, and what impact can you have in your community? And then have 14 Cornell students, architects and planners, respond to the prompts that these 14 young Black boys were given. Lester Young, who is the chancellor of the Board of Regents, heard about it and said, I want to see what this is. So he came to one of our Zoom meetings, and everybody got nervous because Lester's known to be this really aggressive guy who, if something isn't going right, he's going to tell you. And so we're all on Zoom, and it was really clear that because all the work was coming from the perspective of these 14 young Black boys, they were the ones leading the conversations. So what is it to be in the space of Cornell University, albeit online, and to have 14 young Black boys lead conversations about urban transformation? They were talking about their expertise. They were talking about things they knew. They were talking about sets of networks that they knew that were already in place. They were giving this information to Cornell students, and Cornell students were lending creative capacity, lending other sets of capacities to help build the project. But the only people who were able to talk intentionally and intelligently about the projects were these 14 young Black boys. So within one semester, we demonstrated what it meant if you simply shifted the focus, what it meant if you didn't see our communities, because these young people weren't seeing their communities through scarcity. They weren't seeing their communities through lenses of violence or lenses of what we don't have. They were focusing on what they had and who they could activate and partner with in their communities. And so that was the basis of how we began this experiment about what it meant to shift the focus. And I think when you shift the focus, when you shift the focus from devices of supremacy that have long, especially in architecture, taught us how to think and how to value, then I think we end up somewhere else. And part of that, recognizing that they're in a new place, is also recognizing that you have the time. I used to be one of those people who would look at renderings and say, we're the Black people. I don't do that anymore, and I haven't done that since 2017. I'll tell you why. The reason why Black people aren't in the renderings is because we're not a part of the future planning. So it's a deep understanding of what. So let's not ask why Black people. Let's stop asking if there are any people who will ever go on a design review, never ask why there aren't Black people in the building, in the renderings, but begin to articulate that you understand why Black people have been removed from the future planning of these communities. We see it happening in East New York, we see it happening in Brownsville, we see it happening in Queens. And so part of the reshaping of the conversation is to not even wait for, don't wait to be invited to these conversations where we're not going to be in the renderings, but begin to start doing the work where you don't even need a rendering, it's a lived reality. And begin to share these lived realities. And so I'm happy to meet Miss Ina. I'm gonna come by and see you on Tuesday to let you know what we're doing, Miss Ina. But I think once young people have shifted this, and so also thinking about how I would teach design to high school students, and never through the lens of who wants to be an architect. I love being an architect, but there's a reason why Black people make up less than 2% of the profession. I hope there's a future where that changes, but I'm not obsessed with turning every Black kid I meet into an architect. But I think if every Black kid I meet becomes a steward of their communities and recognize that they have the resources and the facilities to be stewards of their communities, there's no way that we won't be in the renderings. One of the things that's happening, we never talk about it, is New York City public school infrastructure is shrinking rapidly because people are moving out of the communities. We can't afford to live in our communities anymore. So 2 weeks ago, the chancellor talked about not cutting the school budget. Great thing to say, but just so you know, the population is down in the New York City public schools. And so what's happening, even as the population shrinks, is you're recognizing that there are fewer opportunities to actually do this work that we're talking about. So it's really important that every time we get an opportunity to encourage a young person to be a steward of their environment, that we take it, that there are many ways to that. There are many ways to spatial liberation. It doesn't just mean you join a particular profession. I believe any profession could be a steward of spatial liberation. And as we work with people in our communities, they're seldom architects. Miss Ina is not an architect, but she is leading the charge of spatial liberation in her community in a way that developers aren't seeing. So we talk about issues of sustainability. That's a conversation that we didn't invent because we were living sustainability in a very dynamic and unique way. And we need to begin to empower our young people to begin to see and understand what sustainability means, so that we don't begin to take on languages or tropes or ways of talking that were actually designed to disenfranchise us and to disinvest us. If there are ways, if we're hearing conversations that we don't understand, it's because those conversations weren't meant for us. We do have ways of communicating. I'll tell my students, and I'll tell my Cornell students who are graduating, thesis students, who sometimes want to explore their own cultural dynamics in the thesis. And I said, if you can't share this work with your grandmother, it's not worth anything.
Huh.
Right?
Woo, we're preaching up in here. Wait a minute. Miss Ina, I'm calling you in just a moment. I just want to thank you so much, actually all three of you, for like it. I feel like this was an awakening. I feel like, you know, there was a light shed on how land is used, who's at the table, who are the partners. And I'm just so grateful for what you all are lending to us based on your experiences. Ms. Ina, I know you had a comment there, and then after your comment, I think we're gonna invite our audience in.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what Peter Robinson's comments were. When we got the land at Tranquility, and we knew that we were insecure from day one, the first thing we did was we put up a structure there that if they had to move us, it would become a political move. In addition, the structure was done by students that went to a local high school that lived in the public housing around the garden. So we didn't want to have a kit of you know, a fancy. We wanted to have the structures built by kids that would walk by, and that would be their legacy. And boy, did it work. And they come back 10, 15 years later, they're young adults now. But they help us build. And the structure that they put in the garden, they were not training to be carpenters or architects. It was community building, and it was legacy building, and it survives, and it's part of their legacy, it's part of our legacy, it's part of the community, and it enriches them and gives them so much currency and agency that they're able to walk around and say, you know, I was a part of building this garden, I built this gazebo, all these benches we built. So it is important that we put ourselves in the work. We don't have to be trained architects. I'm nowhere near there, but you know, I have ideas and I get them implemented with the force and help of the community. So it is important. Thank you for that.
We share with you the definition of architecture from the Greek, the creator of anything.
Right? Yes. So now we have 10 students in our garden envisioning a space, and you're welcome to come by. The next meeting is June 18th, and Black and brown kids, I insist on that. Yes. So it's full circle, full circle.
Full circle. I just want to echo some of the words that you all have been using. Spatial liberation. I'm taking that with me everywhere, all the time. I'm just throwing it out there to folks. But also reimagining space, building upon legacies, community legacies. And then, Peter, when you said, if you can't explain it to your grandma, like, what's the point? If grandma don't get it, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. And so with that, I actually want to turn it, oh, and thank you very much, Catherine, the creator of anything. And all of us are creators. in our own communities, in our homes, in our families, in our practices. So the creator of anything. I want to turn it over to the LP because I think we're gonna do some stuff with our audience now.
Yeah, we're gonna have some conversations with our neighbors. That's the point of all of this. And perfect segue, as Bianca said, we are all creators. And so what we're going to do is we have a prompt that Bianca has shared with us and that we've developed for folks to talk directly to one another. And we will talk for about 8 to 10 minutes as a way of sort of taking a second to just let this conversation breathe and like absorb in us. It's not, you don't have to have anything to say or need to, check your notes or anything, but really just a chance to think about and reflect on this panel and then start to think about what role you have played before or you could play in the future as an artist, a cultural worker, a citizen, or just a neighbor in preserving community memory and history. Are there tangible everyday actions that you can take to be active in reclaiming spaces and narratives for your community? And so this prompt is meant to just be a starting point for you to talk with a group and via chat or via video, however is comfortable for you. And hopefully that will get us developing some questions to hear a little bit more from each other and from our panelists. So with that, our back end team is going to start those groups, and you may see an LP staff member pop in or out of your group just for a moment, and that's just to see if we can support. We're not there to jump in or be super involved in the conversation. Just if you have questions or you want to hear more, we're your people.
So how was it, everyone? Good, rich conversation.
I'd say. Yeah, on the sidebar going, yeah.
Yeah, we as panelists had a great conversation as well. LP, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have a couple minutes for questions or conversation.
Yeah, that's right. So in my breakout room, I was riveted. There's so much knowledge in this room that comes from our panelists, but also from our community members who are here with us today. So essentially, this is an open, informal Q&A, understanding that knowledge and learning goes both ways. And so if you have comments to share, questions to ask, dialogues you want to have, this is that time. And I'll start us off with something that came up in our group with Jamel and Jennifer, which is how we overcome challenges to getting collective ownership of land. So we see these lots and they're there, but how do we overcome that challenge so that it's not so vulnerable to folks who are maneuvering to get that land for profit, disguising it as herbal renewal. And then in addition to that, what do we look out for when those folks who don't have a neighborhood's best interest in mind are coming to prey on that land, and how do we sort of outmaneuver them? That was one of the conversation topics that we would like to bring to the larger group.
There's a really great book. It's Andrew Strobeck, DIY on the Lower East Side. And what he did in that book was trace the transformation of the Lower East Side from the sort of, community initiatives that were about collective ownership of land and ways to sort of community gardens and community art and And it really traced how developers co-opted that practice and really transformed the Lower East Side into what you see today. And so I get nervous when we start throwing around terms like community ownership, whatever. Recognize that developers have already found a way to co-opt that. Yeah. So community land trust, you'll start hearing that conversation a lot in our communities. Be really wary of that. Developers are well versed in how to sort of co-opt these ideas, and in 5 or 10 years, although you may see some Black and brown people at the table in the initial conversations, in 5 years when the projects go up, maybe they'll have a Black or brown person be a bid director. That job might last 6 months. When you think things have been done correctly, especially in the guise of community land trust, just look across New York City and all the community land trusts. There are very few that are the ideals that they set out to be, almost none actually. And so I'm not being disheartening, but I think one has to be really careful when we talk through systems that require sets of expertise that don't come from what we innately have around us. And if we're unable to sort of draw from our own trusted network and sets of expertise, we should be really wary of outside sort of values, and especially about like collective land ownership. It's like, I mean, wealth building is an honorable thing. It's something that I think it's not a pejorative to strive for. But I think finding productive ways to go about that is a great challenge. And I came across his book, a colleague introduced me to his book. And I was aware of the transformation on the Lower East Side because 1989 that's my hate. I was in high school in 89 to 93. I was, working in Soho between 91 and 93 as an intern at a firm. So I saw this transformation, but it didn't dawn on me that this was a co-opting of social values by developers. And it's happening again in our communities. And so I think to be mindful and wary of that would be the one kind of, if I knew of a CLT that worked, I would share it with you. And if you do, please share it with me. I'd love to amplify, but all right.
There's work going on in East New York that they're developing a land trust. So I'm not sure. I think they have an online presence. Catherine, you may be able to talk further on that. They're really trying to really get a handle or ownership of, there's so much vacant land, parking lots. The police use these vacant lands to park their vehicles. Sanitation use it for, hoarding trucks or whatever. So there is a huge, vibrant movement ahead in East New York to create a land trust, and they're worthy of our support. So you could go online. I'm not sure what the particulars are, but like I said, Catherine, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, Jamal just posted in the chat for you all who are interested in the East New York Land Trust, Community Land Trust. He posted a link for us. Any other comments or questions or ideas to share?
Sure, I'll just respond quickly to Ms. Ina. I won't take up too much space, but yes, please check out the East New York Community Land Trust. One thing it has done, there's just so much energy around it, and they've mobilized, they're strong, the brain trust is there. And so topics, they've been having many panels and conversations around economic summits and things like that. So they've been galvanizing community in many ways beyond. It was gone, to me, in my opinion, and I haven't been engaged in the conversations much, but what I've seen is that it's done more than just a focus on the CLT. It's held local banks accountable to what they said, the return in community. I mean, it's just been a transformative process for the community as a whole. So yeah, but yeah, don't know much about what's happening now, but there are many ways that the East New York community has taken advantage of the lands that is available to it. And I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. I want to read a question. There's a couple questions in the chat, but I'll start with what Don wrote. Who are those working today that are best navigating the balance between land back for Indigenous communities and land as a part of reparations for Black communities?
Hmm. Hmm.
Hmm. Uh, that's a good question. You want a name? I can't think of.
I think the silence is such a good answer here in and of itself.
Yeah, yeah.
Such an
That's
important
certainly-
answer. I will say, I'll put this in the chat, but there is, and this isn't someone whose practice is in space and architecture in the same way, but there's a scholar who writes about Black and Indigenous solidarities and coalition building through activism. And the book that I'll put in the chat is called The Black Shoals. And it's more of like an academic theory view of things, but also her intention and her work talks about specific examples of activism where those coalitions were built. And I'd be curious to go back in there and see if any of them were related to space and neighborhoods.
I can
Thank you.
also offer, and I can follow up separately. Dia Vidge, last night's conversation, had mentioned some of the organizing that's happening in St. Louis. There's a group in St. Louis that's doing it, not here. I can check with her on the name of that group that's focused particularly on land back for Indigenous communities. And I can follow up separately to share.
Thank you, Aisha. Another question in the chat: what are specific examples of community land trusts in New York City or elsewhere that have shifted away from a mission of equity? How did they lose track?
I'm not going to call anybody out, first of all, but I think it's really important to look at what happens in this. I say there are like these 5-year increments that we should be looking at carefully. The sort of 5-year implementation phase, right? When these organizations are being put together, who is coming to put them together? What's the brain trust? Where are the resources behind it? And then the 5 years, let's say, during and post implementation. Who is at the table 5 years in? Is it still members of the community? Is it still people who you know and recognize? And then 5 years after that, 15 years, 10 years down the line, do you recognize anyone at the table? Are you at the table? Is anything that was promised has been delivered in a meaningful way? There are lots of ways to quote unquote include us in development of spaces. Maybe you'll get a room to do programming, but you've always had access to rooms to do programming. Like public housing is littered with rooms for community activities, et cetera, et cetera. There are ways through both design and planning that there can be this sort of, I'm giving you my personal opinion, I'm not giving you a fact or law, but there are many ways in which spaces can seem to be allocated to us and for us. But who is supporting us in maintaining those spaces? Do we have the resources to maintain those spaces? And I think that answers the question. And I think I'm patient. I believe in the 1,000-year trajectory. It took us 1,000 years to get where we are now. It'll probably take, a significantly long time for us to see real meaningful justice. But I think we shouldn't be, I think an easy buy-in into sets of promises that aren't ours by definition or ours by desire or design. I'm deeply wary of those. I see neighborhoods changing. I see glass towers going in. I see promises being made that will be a part of these glass towers. And I believe in trust in Black ingenuity and what Black communities can build and sustain, rear and maintain. But maybe it's not a glass tower.
I think also a lot of it has to be with education. I'm one of 4 African-American women, we all own properties. We all have children. I don't have children, but I consider the community my children. But we talk to the young people. We're living examples of what can be. And, you know, we renovate our properties. We encourage, you know, kids to invest in land and buy land, you know, and yes, it's good to be altruistic and work in your community, but there is really no virtue in poverty. You can live a good, you know, productive, giving back life and still also participate in the mainstream. So we have to let the young people know the possibilities that, yes, you know, own land. If you can't own it here, go to Detroit, go somewhere, go upstate, and don't give away your properties. I see it happening in our neighborhoods. You know, the stakeholders, they don't talk to their children. The children don't really know what they have. And then, you know, the parents die and then there's a big fight. And then they sell it out to the friendly developer that comes in the neighborhood and give them a suitcase of money and they walk away. Hattie Carthen's house is now owned by a Jewish person. I mean, how is that? Hattie Carthen, that worked to build our community, her house was sold for 1.5 to a developer and he's gutting it and he caused a lot of ruckus on the neighborhood, but there's a lot of fight back. So we have to speak to the young people coming up, let them know, yes, the same way it's done on the other end, we can do it too. And talk to our young people, let them know. They must know, I was raised, know that, you know, we have to own land. And you don't have to have a lot of money to own land. And you have to put yourself into, you know, working towards gaining access to land and developing land and have ideas. You don't have to pay rent forever. So it's a mindset, really. It's, you know, we can't just really rely on opportunities or people to do stuff for us. We have to make our own way. And we do have the power. Look, our movement is based on Black and brown people taking over land. And now the infrastructure, I firmly believe that community gardens build New York City infrastructure because they build and they live off the value that we've created to sell their glass towers. You know, that's how they bring people to the community. First thing they come in the community, oh, they use it. They say, oh, there's a community garden 2 blocks away or a community at the end of the block. And so, yeah, so we have to really inculcate in our children the value of owning land.
All right. There's actually some really great suggestions that were just put in the chat. I just want to acknowledge that. I think it was like Patina Lee. Just some of the references I recognize. So yeah. Not pessimistic. I thought it was pessimistic. Here's some optimism. Directly.
I would also add that, you know, in order for you know, intergenerational transfer and for folks to understand that there is a history of, you know, land ownership by people of color, like we have to begin to tell those stories better and not wait for like a Netflix documentary to do it, like to, you know, whatever the systems of distribution for information are within our own communities, like leveraging those channels to reach the people who will be greatly impacted by land ownership shifting in the future. You know, one of the projects that, and then like doing this from a lens of like, we can do this ourselves, right? Like, and every little bit counts. Right now, as a board member for the Ocean Hill-Brownsville Coalition of Young Professionals, which is like a collective of young professionals from the neighborhood that pay dues annually, that we are then granting out to community groups as a community grant to support local projects that fuel community vitality and history preservation. Like we just kind of like awarded, you know, 2 grants, but one of them for that totaled up to $5,000. One of them was a project. It's like in the Brownsville Heritage House by Empowering Youth Towards Excellence, that are working with the young people to document the griots in the community and their stories about the histories that they that are being lost as people pass on, so that can be kind of archived in our local institution of cultural archiving, the Heritage House. And so like that's important to us, like the babies of this neighborhood. And if we see that folks aren't funding that work locally, we need to fill the gaps and kind of like build this the self-sufficiency that we know that we have, because there's so many talented and brilliant people that are off in the world doing amazing things that seek opportunities to build capacity for preserving our history, so that the folks that come after us don't feel as though there was a place for them, and that their story was never important to the history of the place.
I think to echo that we have a history of ownership in this country and throughout our history that I think I would prioritize overall. I work in Ithaca with the St. James AME Zion Church. They're the oldest AME Zion Church building in America. This year they celebrate 190 years old. So the mother church in New York is older, but the mother church in New York City has moved 5 times. So St. James it's a space that has been in Black ownership for 190 years in the Ithaca community. And so I am deeply committed to sort of celebrating that space and amplifying that story. It's a space that we know Harriet Tubman visited. Harriet Tubman liked to hang out in Ithaca. I didn't know that was her private personal life. She had a girlfriend, a homegirl that she would visit that lived on Cascadilla Street in Ithaca. Frederick Douglass spoke in that meeting room of that church. The university is now doing an archaeological dig at that site to begin to sort of unearth basically the evidence of Black life and Black ownership. The Elks Lodge in Ithaca is 245 years old. So we had Black building ownership, and they've lost it's no longer under Black ownership. It's now owned by a white developer who's going to historically renovate and regard that history, so they say. But I mentioned those two things because I think we have a history of ownership, and we have a history of preserving our spaces. Going on 245 years in America. I think finding ways to amplify those stories and invest in those stories and invest in those practices, I think is how we steward the future of Black communities. I think when we talk about ownership, I think let's be really mindful that we've had a history of ownership in these communities that we're talking about. Why has ownership gone down in these communities? And there are a whole bunch of reasons that I think we need to acknowledge before we even begin to tackle the what is next, right? And what I get wary of is we move into practices that don't reflect the history of how we already know how to own, right? There's a colleague who just started this really great initiative. I think it's called Mama, I'm gonna get them, like, let's say Mama Fern House, which is a way of acknowledging how her family's brownstone history in Brooklyn emerged and really recognizing Caribbean families migrating were often engaged in collective ownership and collective sharing of land, of their spaces that they occupied. And she's trying to reignite that practice of ownership and what it means to be in collective shared space. And so I am committed to these models because they're models that we created in really oppressive and offensive times in terms of Black history. And so these are the practices that I am more interested in. I'm more interested in practices that are based on expertise that we bring rather than expertise that, and I don't discredit any sort of, I'm a university professor, I'm not discrediting, learned knowledge, but there's something about, in terms of what is sustenance and what is scalable, I think the practices that we have brought to the table, to our own tables, are the practices that I'm more deeply, because those are the ones that have proven to work, right? These other models have not proven to work and be benefit of our communities. one of the reasons why I teach my studios in Brownsville and East New York, Brooklyn, they're usually under the guise of housing studios. Part of it was I point out Brownsville has a particularly unique 70-year history of public housing initiatives. 70 years. About like there are over 50 iterative typologies of housing and ways of thinking about housing. None of them have really worked. And we're seeing version 71 and 72 popping up in front of our eyes. And there's somehow this belief that another version of this way of thinking about how we live and how we collectively sort of assemble and congregate and participate in shared practices, that another version of this, like over 100-year practice that has never worked for our communities, will somehow magically work again. And so I don't have a solution. But I do know that we have had the solution before because we continue to live successful lives in this country and in this city. And I'm more interested in finding ways to invest in those successful ways of living. Right.
Thank you. So I think we're gonna wrap up our conversation this afternoon. I want to, again, thank LP for gathering us all and bringing us together to work in the collective to exchange ideas. I think that's the core of what many people were saying here today, that we are a part of something bigger than ourselves. And we're powerful as a group, as a unit. And as you move forward today, I want you to think about things like narrative of neighborhoods, spatial liberation, the importance of putting yourself in the work, that we have our own powers of distribution. We also can be the creators of any and everything. And so carry that with you. Tell other people, share the word, share the knowledge. And speaking of knowledge, this chat has tons of great resources. So before you all leave, click on those links, copy the chat, do what you need to do. But there are many people, including these panelists, that are doing the work. And so grateful to meet Peter and Quardean. I feel like I need to be in East New York now. Like I didn't know. And I'm like, oh, let me go see what's happening over there. Let me go record some stories. So again, thank you. Spread the word about all these projects and all the work, and continue to live in light, guide yourself in love, and have a wonderful Saturday.
All right. Thank you all. This is wonderful. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great
Thanks,
conversation. Great
everyone.
conversation.
And we will still have our closing brunch. It's postponed, so it won't be tomorrow, but please feel free to register at the link in the chat and join us when we reschedule.
Okay, thank you all very much. Great conversation. Bye. Yeah.